basically what we will present here is Work Package 4, Crisis Management Capacities. And this part is divided in three sections, which is the first one, what capacities does the EU have? And basically here we try to map all the sort of capacities that EU institutions have when it comes to managing transboundary crises. Then we move to what are regulators doing, which is basically the role of EU agencies in the overall crisis management. And finally, what does the European Parliament do, and how does it contribute to accountability, which is basically focusing on MEPs and the different mechanisms that they use to when they get involved in crisis management.
Our team mapped crisis management capacities across transboundary sectors, and we mapped them in accordance to the 7 crisis management tasks, and those are detection and early warning, sense-making, decision-making, coordination, communication, and accountability. When it comes to detection, we looked for capacities that, for example, concerns horizon scanning and detecting emerging threats or emerging crises. For sense-making, we looked at capacities for collecting, for managing information, and for analyzing that information in order to get a common situational picture among the often many involved actors. For decision-making, we looked for capacities for example, decision-making protocols and different frameworks for making decisions, and also crisis rooms, for example. For coordination, we looked for capacities to manage and coordinate the involved actors within themselves, but also regarding actions, for example. For meaning-making communication, we looked for capacities for formulating a shared message of the crisis and actually bringing that out to the public and to involved actors. And for accountability, we looked for capacities both for learning and for keeping the involved actors accountable and decision makers. As you can see, we found a lot of transboundary crisis capacities. In total, we found over 200, and as you can see, we found the same pattern emerging across all the sectors, and that was that we found a lot of detection and sense-making capacities, and we didn't find as much decision-making, meaning-making, communication, and accountability capacities. And we also found that detection and sense-making capacity seems to be very sector-specific, often targeting, for example, in the health sector, just one type of disease, while decision-making, coordination, and meaning-making capacity seems to be more general and not at all as specific. The key findings of our mapping exercise was that we have seen a major growth of capacities, and capacities lies mainly actually in pre-crisis activities. So, for example, making sense of an emerging threat before it actually turns into a crisis. And that also involves, for example, crisis management exercises. And the curious evolution is that we found that many detection capacities has been enriched with sense-making, which means that capacities that used to be just about detecting emerging threats has been enriched with analytical functions. And what this tells us is that transboundary crises are becoming more and more complex, and it becomes increasingly hard for the involved actors to make sense of what's going on, and that's why the EU is putting more and more effort into helping involved actors to actually get a common situational picture. Another interesting finding is that we found very little cross-sector activity. So we found that the crisis capacities seem to be rather isolated within their sector, and we didn't find a lot of capacities that actually function across sectors. And this is of course an interesting finding because many transboundary crises seems to move across sectors as well. As you can see in this graph, we saw a major growth of early warning systems over time, and this also refers to our finding of more and more detection and sense-making systems. And regarding early warning systems, when you break it down into sub-activities, you can see that the main focus of early warning systems is usually actually helping involved actors to get a better view of what's going on and to enhance a common situational picture by, for example, the exchange of information. And this also refers to our finding that many detection activities has been enriched with an analytical sense-making function. We collected all our data in a user-friendly database that you can find at societalsecurity.eu. And here you can easily choose your crisis type. You can search on different types of crises across different kinds of sectors, and you can compare it between sectors. You can look at the distribution of, for example, sense-making versus coordination activities across sectors, and many other things. So check it out.
My task within this TransCrisis project was focused on the study of European agencies. So let me say, what are the European agencies? In fact, European agencies are institutions with informative and regulatory tasks in specific policy sectors. And we may find many of these agencies in Europe. In fact, there are about 40 in many different areas. You can find, for example, the European Aviation Safety Agency or the European Banking Authority or the European Medicines Agency, among many others. We can ask if these agencies can contribute to crisis management at the EU level. And the answer is definitely yes. Of course, not only the solo role, meaning that there are many other institutions having a role in crisis management, but agencies may affect the capacity of the EU to perform crisis leadership because they have expertise, and for this reason, agencies can contribute in a moment of a crisis to its management, providing knowledge, providing instruments, policy instruments, providing also coordinating capabilities, and also advice to the policymakers. There is also a lot of differences among agencies because some agencies operate in sectors where they have a lot of responsibilities, and the mandate they have from the European Parliament or the European institutions can be very different. No? But in spite of these differences, they have significant capacities to be involved in European transboundary crises. So, and which are our findings and which are the policy implications of these findings? Well, I can say that agencies have, as I said, a technical capacity to largely confront crises, to coordinate different bodies at national level, but sometimes also they are restricted by legal and political boundaries. Because they own the mandate to the role of the Commission and the member states. And this sometimes creates some difficulties for agencies to be really effective. As I said, there is a lot of diversity among agencies, and the policy and the political relevance of each crisis depends on many different sectors. So it depends the type of the crisis. You can find, well, that the role of the agency may be different, and also the policy sector. So there are sectors in which have a strong technical background, and here the role of the agency is stronger compared to other policy areas, policy sectors where there is no so strong technical relevance, and there are more political issues under discussion. Agencies are not meant to solve political issues, so agencies are really administrative units to support and to develop policies, but not to make political decisions. But what is important for agencies is they have a capability to absorb administrative rivalities and also tensions among different EU institutions, but also among member states, and also this multi-level structure very common in Europe between the state level and the EU level. They can be much more effective in solving the administrative gridlocks and rivalities that are common sometimes in EU policy making. And just to finish our findings, I want to say something also about the policy implications of our findings. No? On the one side, we think that agencies should be capable to react to crises. So there are many different examples, cases in which the role of European agencies has been important, and many unexpected crises in the future can also be dealt, or the agencies can have a strong role there to be effective and react on the short term. So we should expect that the agencies should have the capability to react to crises, and sometimes we have to equip them to make them for them easier to do this reaction to crisis European-wide. The second point is about that agencies should be prepared to work on the pressure produced by transboundary crises. This means that agencies not only have the need to be prepared, but in the sense of having the resources, but they also have to have the mentality, the culture, and the orientation sometimes to react. So it means more than the capabilities, it means also the attitudes. And finally, we also have a question that is about, well, if they have the capabilities, should some agencies be awarded with some special faculties that only will work in the emergency moments, just to be more effective in preventing the crisis or in avoiding the worst effects of the crisis? Should be some type of political decisions to delegate to agencies specific powers to cope with crisis, and just for the moment in which the crisis is really hitting European societies? This is just a question, but we want also to put on the table for further reflection and thinking.
The European Parliament has been is very vocal in transboundary crisis management. What is interesting, though, is that if you look at the economic and financial crisis, and to some extent also the refugee crisis, the Parliament has not had a lot of substantive influence on the policies being adopted and implemented, but they have made a lot of noise, and they have managed actually to get quite a few oversight powers. Now, the Parliament not having a lot of power in transboundary crisis, particularly when it comes to the Eurozone crisis, it's a bit of a conundrum. And in a way, the EU's traditional triangle, where you usually have the Commission, the Council and the Parliament, has changed to a quadrangle, where you also have the European Council. And several high-profile European Parliament politicians, such as the former President Martin Schulz, have said that Parliament during the Eurozone crisis have effectively been reduced to rubber-stamping agreements that have been reached between governments in back rooms in Brussels. But what you see is that Parliament has actually been quite effective in democratically controlling these institutions. So Parliament hasn't got any sort of physical capacity in transboundary crisis. It hasn't got a crisis room or any of that sort like the European Commission has. However, it got lots of negotiating capacities. So if you look at the Eurozone crisis, one transboundary crisis that the Parliament has not been so much involved in, you can see the Parliament having astute negotiation capacities to play on what you could call the delaying strategy and what you could also call linking policy arenas. So in terms of delaying strategy, when Parliament has been involved under the ordinary legislative procedure, it has used the different time horizons of the Council and the Parliament to its advantage. So the European Parliament has a much longer time horizon. You only have elections every 5 years, whereas in the Council you always have a change of governments. And it has been less sensitive to policy failures. And it has been able to threaten to veto on legislation if it didn't get its way. The other element is that you have the possibility to link different policy issues. So for instance, when you have legislation being negotiated at the same time, or when you have package deals. So accountability can be understood as a matter of degree rather than black or white accountability or not. Accountability, if we look at the definition, has 3 legs. So first, there is the obligation of, for instance, executive bodies to offer information. Secondly, to explain themselves. And lastly, they may be sanctioned. So you could either have one of these or all of them for accountability. So you could have more or less accountability. In terms of the role of the European Parliament in transboundary crisis, when we look at the Eurozone crisis, you could look at both formal accountability, so what's actually written in the law, and you can look at de facto accountability, so how are these accountability provisions actually materialized in practice. If we start with the jury, formal accountability, I have found in my research that the Parliament has many more oversight powers over executive bodies when you have a transboundary crisis. So when legislation is about addressing, for instance, the Eurozone crisis or the migration crisis could also be another example, when legislation is negotiated as part of a package deal, and when legislation is highly salient. So when these 3 features appear, you have a lot of oversight powers from the European Parliament. But when these 3 features do not appear, you have less oversight powers. So that's sort of at the aggregate level. Then you have what is called the economic dialogue, whereby the European Parliament's Economic and Monetary Committee can ask member states, so finance minister who are breaching with the EU's rules, can ask the Commission, the President of the European Council and the President of ECOFIN and the Eurogroup to appear before the Economic and Monetary Committee to render account. And in my research, I have been looking at all of the hearings with finance ministers from countries that either breach with the Stability and Growth Pact or have macroeconomic imbalances. And what my research shows is that these finance ministers, they do indeed inform Parliament of their actions. They also explain Parliament of their actions, but they are not sanctioned in any ways. MEPs, they come to these meetings rather prepared, but the setup could be improved quite a bit. As the setup is now, it doesn't really induce proper conversation and proper quizzing, so there is room for the Parliament to improve on holding these executive actors more accountable.
So to end this part on the work package number 4, well, basically, we address 3 issues. The capacity of EU institutions to deal with transboundary crises. And here we can see 3 main findings. And it is basically, we see that capacities are scattered throughout different EU institutions with varying degrees of power. The second point on this part is that we see a mixed picture within EU institution capacities, where we see a division between political and technical lines on how to respond to crisis management. And finally, sometimes capacities are there in these EU institutions. However, we may encounter that under some situations, these capacities are not fully implemented due to the multi-level conditions that the EU is embedded. The second point that I would like to address is, are these patterns surprising? Yes, they are very much. Because we have encountered that they offer different institutional scenarios where the type of crisis, the policy sector, affect the overall response to crisis management. And finally, how, if at all, these capacities should be developed. And basically, we think that the design of EU institutions should provide a good balance between politics and technical dimensions. This is basically addressing the question between democratic legitimacy and the rapidness in the response to transboundary crisis. Also, we believe that EU institutions could work under a framework of uncertainty, where not always the answers are readily available to be implemented, and where they can be flexible to address issues as they emerge.